They call Belarus Europe's last dictatorship. It is a country frozen in time. Soviet monuments still stand in the squares. The secret police still go by their old name, and the state still puts its citizens to death for the gravest offences. In December 2015, a crime occurred in the capital that would test even this unforgiving system. 2 young people were butchered in their apartment, stabbed so many times that the coroner counted over 140 wounds between them. The killers had tried to make it look like a robbery, stealing cash and winter coats, and even a box of chocolates. But investigators knew immediately that this was something else. The male victim, Vyacheslav Tikhomirov, was 32 years old and living in Minsk, the capital of Belarus, in 2015. By all accounts, he had led a complicated life. As a teenager, he spent time in Poland with his mother. There he fell in with a bad crowd and even had a brush with the law for a hate crime, which got him deported back to Belarus. But in Minsk, Vyacheslav seemed to be settling down. He inherited a small apartment on Alibegova Street from his grandmother, and found steady work as a security guard. It was an ordinary life, lived in a nondescript Soviet-era apartment block on the city's outskirts. Neighbours would later recall him as a quiet man, stocky, and with a Slavic tattoo on one arm, nothing obviously remarkable. In August 2013, at a local event in a Minsk department store, 24-year-old Vyacheslav met a young woman named Alina Shulganova. Alina was then 23, a kindergarten teacher with bright eyes and an eager smile. She lived with her mother and was active in the state-sponsored Belarusian Youth Union, the BRSM, known for patriotic volunteer work. By background, Alina was the picture of respectability, the sort of person one might trust to watch over children. When she met Vyacheslav, sparks flew. The two started dating, and before long, Alina moved into Vyacheslav's flat on Alibegova Street. Alina's mother approved of the match. Despite Vyacheslav's past troubles abroad, he seemed to be a decent young man now. For a time, the young couple lived together and dreamed of a future. But life was not easy. Vyacheslav eventually quit his job, and the burden of supporting the household fell on Alina. Her modest salary as a daycare teacher, supplemented by a little help from her mother, kept them afloat. This imbalance put strain on the relationship. Still, Alina remained devoted. She believed in Vyacheslav and hoped he would find direction. Unbeknownst to her, however, Vyacheslav had already begun looking elsewhere for affection. At some point in 2015, Vyacheslav met another woman, Victoria Keshikova, a 24-year-old from Minsk. Victoria was lively and independent. She found her way into Vyacheslav's life as his new love interest, and soon he was cheating on Alina. When Alina discovered the betrayal, she was devastated. She moved out of the apartment in heartbreak and anger. Vyacheslav, remorseful, pleaded with her for forgiveness. In an unusual arrangement born perhaps of confusion or guilt, all 3 of them attempted briefly to live under the same roof that summer. It was a bizarre and untenable situation. Alina and Victoria reportedly barely spoke to each other despite sharing the small flat. Within weeks, the tension boiled over. On June 26, 2015, Vyacheslav finally asked Alina to leave for good. He had chosen Victoria. Being cast aside in this way was crushing for Alina. She had invested 2 years of her life in Vyacheslav, even supporting him financially. Now he had replaced her with a younger woman. Friends later described Alina as heartbroken, humiliated, and quietly furious. In her mind, Vyacheslav was still a good man, the man she loved, led astray by a conniving interloper. She placed the blame squarely on Victoria. Alina's resentment toward her rival grew obsessive. She was not content to walk away and let the new couple be. Instead, Alina started plotting ways to win Vyacheslav back and to remove Victoria from the picture. In the months that followed, Vyacheslav and Victoria settled into life as a couple. They remained in the Alibagova street flat, while Alina moved back in with her mother elsewhere in Minsk. Then, in a cruel twist of fate, Vyacheslav suffered a serious health setback. That autumn, the 32-year-old man had a stroke. Although he survived, the stroke partially debilitated him. He could still walk, but his speech became slurred and slow. This once strong security guard was now physically weakened, reliant on Victoria's help in daily life. To Alina, hearing of Vyacheslav's condition may have stirred concern, and perhaps a renewed hope. A vulnerable Vyacheslav might need caring support. In her mind, perhaps he needed her. But as long as Victoria was in the picture, Alina felt she had no chance to regain her former boyfriend's affections. She hired a private detective to spy on Victoria, hoping to dig up any compromising information. If Victoria could be exposed as unfaithful or unsavory, Alina thought, Vyacheslav might leave her. According to later court testimony, Alina even instructed the detective to set a honey trap for Victoria. She suggested finding a man who could seduce Victoria and be photographed with her, creating fake evidence of Victoria cheating. Alina's plan was to then show those staged photos to Vyacheslav, hoping to break their relationship apart. It was a convoluted scheme, but it shows how determined and desperate Alina had become. This plan, however, went nowhere. The detective Alina hired turned out to be a fraud, a con man who took her money but did little of substance. In fact, he had been convicted 3 times previously for similar scams. And in Alina's case, he was eventually prosecuted for conducting illegal private investigations. By late 2015, with her hopes of sabotaging Victoria's reputation dashed, Alina grew increasingly frustrated. Every day that passed, her ex-boyfriend was growing closer to Victoria and further out of Alina's reach. By December 2015, Alina was a 26-year-old woman scorned, nursing a toxic mix of heartbreak and rage. Jealousy had dug in deep. According to investigators, she finally resolved that if she couldn't expose her rival, she would hurt her instead. Alina wanted Victoria out of Vyacheslav's life, not necessarily dead, but hurt badly enough to disappear for a while. Perhaps, she imagined, if Victoria were injured or frightened enough, she would leave Vyacheslav, and Alina could comfort him in the aftermath. It was a twisted logic driven by emotion. And to carry it out, Alina turned to the most dangerous acquaintance she knew, her next-door neighbor. That neighbor was Alexander Zhilnikov, a 43-year-old laborer who lived in the same neighborhood as Alina. Zhilnikov was nothing like the clean-cut professionals Alina had tried before. He was a rough-hewn man, a sawmill worker who liked to drink and had a criminal past. Originally from Russia, the Tambov region, Zhilnikov had moved to Belarus years earlier. He had been convicted 3 times in the 1990s for theft and hooliganism. At work, he had a reputation for being belligerent and trying to bully others. Only one person at the sawmill really fell into Zhilnikov's orbit, a much younger co-worker named Vyacheslav Tikhomirov. Zhilnikov and Tikhomirov made an unlikely pair. Tikhomirov was just 23, 2 decades younger than Zhilnikov. He'd had a very hard life. He never knew his father, and his mother lost custody of him due to alcoholism and then died after being hit by a car while drunk. Tikhomirov grew up an orphan in state institutions, emerging into adulthood with a chip on his shoulder and a drinking habit of his own. People who knew him described him as an angry young man, resentful of the whole world. Perhaps he found a sort of father figure in Alexander Zhilnikov at the sawmill. Zhilnikov, for his part, enjoyed having an impressionable protégé to do his bidding. Under Zhilnikov's influence, often fueled by alcohol, Tikhomirov's worst tendencies could flourish. When Alina approached Zhilnikov in December 2015, it was a fateful convergence of need and opportunity. She asked if he could help her with a problem. The problem was her ex-boyfriend's new girlfriend. Alina wanted someone to beat up Victoria, to injure or terrorize her just enough that she'd be out of the picture for a time. She made it clear she didn't intend murder. Her wish was to have Victoria taught a lesson, not killed. Zhilnikov listened and agreed to take the job. He even told Alina that if Victoria were roughed up and hospitalized, It would give Alina an opening to rekindle things with Vyacheslav during Victoria's recovery. Alina was willing to pay for this violent favor. The price they settled on was 500 Belarusian rubles, roughly a few hundred US dollars at the time, an almost insultingly small sum for what was to come. Zhilnikov accepted the money without hesitation. To carry out the attack, Zhilnikov recruited his young colleague Sukharko as backup. He likely needed Sukharko's muscle and perhaps simply trusted him as a partner in crime. Zhilnikov, with his ex-convict's bravado, assured the younger man that if anything went wrong, they'd face at most 5 years in prison for assault. In Zhilnikov's cynical view, a short stint behind bars was the worst-case scenario for them. Sukharko agreed to help. The two men armed themselves with a large knife and a metal rod and prepared to make Alina's problem go away. Alina provided Zhilnikov and Sukharko with everything they needed, the address of Vyacheslav's apartment, and even a photograph of Victoria so they could recognize the target. She knew the apartment well. It had been her home not long ago, and she likely still had keys. However, there's no indication she planned to be present. Alina was careful to distance herself. She hired thugs to do the dirty work, leaving herself an apparent alibi. In her mind, this was a contained plan. A quick break-in, a beating, and a frightened rival who might then flee back to her hometown, or at least leave Vyacheslav. Alina could then swoop in to console her ex. It was a fantasy of heroism born out of malice. But the reality that unfolded was far uglier than Alina ever envisioned. By entrusting her vendetta to Zhilnikov and Sukharko, she had set in motion events she could no longer control. These two men were volatile and prone to violence, and on the appointed day, they would unleash something far beyond a mere lesson. The date was set, December 16th, 2015. Zhilnikov and Sukharko planned to strike that evening, when they expected both Vyacheslav and Victoria to be at home in the Alibagova Street flat. But before they ever got there, the two men decided to embark on an additional criminal venture of their own. On the day before the planned attack, Zhilnikov and Sukharko traveled to the small semi-rural suburb of Kolodishchi, just outside Minsk. Kolodishchi was an unremarkable village of low houses and farm plots. One of those houses had recently been renting out a room to none other than Vyacheslav Sukharko. The tenant Sukharko knew that his landlord, a 59-year-old pensioner named Timoshenko, kept a large amount of cash at home, about $10,000 in savings. Perhaps thinking it would be wise to have more money or just seized by greed, the two decided to rob this man before carrying out Alina's job. On the night of December 15th, Zhilnikov and Sukharko entered the Kolodishchi house where the landlord lived. Fueled by alcohol, the encounter turned instantly vicious. The two younger men beat the landlord mercilessly with a metal rod, raining down 33 blows, 17 of them to the head. At one point, Sukharko later admitted he remembered the cache of money. That was their motive for the attack. But in the chaos of the beating, they failed in the original goal. The noise of the assault had alarmed neighbors, who began shouting and threatening to call the police. Panicking, Zhilnikov and Sukharko fled without taking a single ruble from the house. They left the 59-year-old victim dead or dying, his money untouched. It was a gratuitous murder, committed for nothing. This incident would soon tie into the larger case, but at that moment, the killers had other priorities. They still had Alina's assignment to carry out the next day. After escaping the scene in Kolodishchi, Zhilnikov and Sukharko presumably lay low. The murder of the pensioner did not immediately result in their capture, but it did put local police on alert. By the following day, December 16th, authorities in the Minsk region were undoubtedly aware that a violent killer or killers were at large, having beaten a man to death. They may have even had descriptions or leads. However, the events of the next 24 hours would complicate the manhunt dramatically. As evening fell, Zhilnikov and Sukharko prepared to execute the plan Alina had set for them. They spent part of the afternoon drinking, fortifying themselves with liquor before the deed. By nightfall, they headed to Alibagova Street in Minsk, the location of Vyacheslav's apartment. It was freezing outside, a typical Belarusian winter night. Inside the modest flat on the third floor, only Vyacheslav was home. The 32-year-old, still recovering from his stroke, might have been alone watching television or resting. He had no idea what was coming. Sukharko and Zhilnikov arrived at the apartment building and somehow gained entry to the flat. Once the door opened, the attack was instantaneous. The two intruders didn't bother with pretenses or threats. They set upon Vyacheslav immediately with a knife. Zhilnikov, the larger man, grabbed and restrained Vyacheslav, while Sukharko began a frenzy of stabbing. The first strikes came right at the entrance of the flat. Vyacheslav tried to fight back or flee, but he was at a grave disadvantage, partly disabled by his stroke and ambushed by two assailants. He was stabbed repeatedly in the torso. Even after he fell to the floor, Sukharko continued plunging the blade into him over and over. The ferocity was horrifying. Sukharko stabbed with such frenzy that he even slashed his own hand by accident in the melee, cutting himself amid the violence. By the time they were done, Vyacheslav lay lifeless in a widening pool of blood. He had suffered an estimated 80 stab wounds. The original plan, if one could still call it that, had been to beat up two people, Vyacheslav and Victoria, then stage a robbery. With Vyacheslav now dead, Zhilnikov and Sukharko turned to the next steps. They began ransacking the apartment to make it look like a burglary gone wrong, just as they'd discussed. Drawers were pulled out, belongings tossed. They grabbed some valuables within easy reach, cash, a couple of winter jackets, and even some sweets. In a bizarre detail, the intruders picked up a box of chocolates and a fancy cake, a Viennese torte, that were in the flat, holiday treats the couple had bought. Amid this ransacking, they didn't forget the main remaining target, Victoria. She was not home when they arrived, but they knew she might return at any moment. And indeed, she did. At some point that night, 24-year-old Victoria came back to the apartment, unaware of the nightmare inside. The moment Victoria stepped through the door, Zhilnikov and Sukharko pounced. The attack on her was as merciless as the one on Vyacheslav. Victoria had almost no time to react or defend herself. The two men swiftly overpowered her and stabbed her repeatedly until she, too, lay dead on the floor. Later, forensic counts tallied around 63 stab wounds on Victoria's body, a staggering number for a single victim, indicating the same frenzied overkill that had been inflicted on her boyfriend. In the space of minutes, a young couple's lives had been brutally extinguished. In the silence after the killings, the apartment was a scene of absolute horror. Blood spattered the walls and soaked into the carpet. The two assailants, slightly injured themselves and drenched in gore, hurried to finish their staged robbery. They snatched up anything that might suggest theft. Some cash, personal documents like a passport, clothing, and the box of chocolates and cake they'd already eyed. One of the killers later admitted he took the sweets specifically because his own girlfriend's birthday was coming up in a few days, and he thought the treats might make a nice gift. With their grisly work done, Zhilnikov and Sukharko fled the scene. It was the dead of night in a city where most people mind their own business. If any neighbors heard something, they did not intervene. The killers slipped away into the darkness, carrying the stolen items. Outside, the cold air must have been biting. The pair hailed a taxi after the murders and rode out of the city. Their destination? Alina Shulganova's home. Sometime in the early hours of December 17th, Alina answered a knock at her door to find Zhilnikov and Sukharko standing there. She knew these men had gone to hurt Victoria, but she did not expect them to show up in the middle of the night. According to later testimony, the men bluntly informed Alina that things had gone horribly wrong. "We overdid it," Zhilnikov reportedly told her. "We killed them, both of them, and now you'll have to pay more." In that moment, Alina's scheme crumbled into ashes. This was not what she had wanted. The shock was overwhelming. She burst into tears. Two people, including the man she still loved, were dead at the hands of these brutes she had set in motion. Alina sobbed uncontrollably, but there was no undoing it. After a few moments, she managed to collect herself. Perhaps survival instinct kicked in. She realized she was now in danger too. These men had just murdered two people. What was stopping them from silencing her, the one witness to their hire? In fact, Zhilnikov would later claim that Sukharko talked about killing Alina as well. so there'd be no witness to tie up the loose end. Whether they truly considered it that night is unknown, but certainly Alina must have felt the threat. Ultimately, they spared Alina. Instead, the men demanded more money, compensation for the greater trouble they had taken on by committing double homicide. It's unclear how much she gave them, if anything, or what promises were made. But by the time Zhilnikov and Sukharko left Alina's residence, she had made a fateful decision. She would not call the police. Despite her horror and regret, Alina Shulganova chose to protect herself and her role in this crime. If she went to the authorities, she would have to confess that she had orchestrated the attack, so she kept silent, hoping perhaps that the killers would disappear and that she could pretend none of this had happened. Later, Alina would tell a court through tears that she wished she had turned them in right then. But in December 2015, fear and self-preservation won out. Meanwhile, back at Alibagova Street, the bodies of Vyacheslav and Victoria lay undiscovered for days. Friends and co-workers might have assumed the couple was away or simply busy. It was the holiday season approaching. But for Vyacheslav's mother, something felt dreadfully wrong. His mother lived abroad in Poland, yet she maintained close contact with her son. When she couldn't reach him for several days, alarm bells went off. After several days, her concern became urgent. The mother travelled to Minsk in haste, arriving by December 20th. She went straight to her son's address. Inside, in the flat she knew so well, she found a nightmare. Her son and his girlfriend lay dead amid a ransacked mess. It was a vision no parent should ever have to witness. She immediately called the police, Minsk City Police and Belarus's militia, as law enforcement is still called there, responded swiftly to the Alibagova street scene on December 20th. They found both victims, stabbed dozens of times. Drawers and cabinets were open, items strewn about, suggesting a burglary. Investigators collected evidence methodically, even as they steeled themselves against the horror. They found 2 distinct sets of footprints in the blood, indicating at least 2 perpetrators. They also noted a trail of blood that was not from the victims, possibly from a perpetrator's cut, as one killer had indeed injured his hand. Amid the debris, they logged missing items, some cash, clothing, the victim's identification documents, and oddly, some confectionaries. It looked like robbery was a motive, but the ferocity of the stabbings stood out. Seasoned detectives knew that ordinary burglars rarely butcher victims with such overkill. This crime felt personal. The double homicide of a young couple sent shockwaves through Minsk, but what the police didn't announce publicly that day was that they already had reason to suspect who might be involved. The very same weekend, just a day earlier, a similarly brutal murder had occurred in the outskirts. The killing of the 59-year-old man in Kolodishchi on December 15th had already launched a parallel investigation. Neighbours in that village had given authorities descriptions of 2 suspicious men fleeing that scene, and crucially, the dead man in Kolodishchi was not a random target. He was known to have been renting a room to a young male tenant. That tenant had since vanished, and police strongly suspected him in the landlord's death. His name was known to them, Vyacheslav Sukharko. When the Minsk investigators at Alibagova Street learned of the Kolodishchi case, or vice versa, the puzzle pieces rapidly came together. 2 violent crime scenes, separated by only 24 hours and a few miles, both involving extreme savagery. It was too much of a coincidence. In a small country like Belarus, it wouldn't take long for word to spread through law enforcement channels about likely suspects. Investigators from the Ministry of Internal Affairs and the Minsk City Police worked jointly, scouring known addresses and contacts for Sukharko and Zhilnikov. It's quite possible that Alina Shulganova herself came under suspicion early. As the ex-girlfriend, she would naturally be questioned in a case where a man and his new partner are murdered. That is standard detective work. We do know that within a matter of days, police tracked the 2 men to an apartment in Kolodishchi. To capture the suspects, authorities enlisted a special forces unit known as Almaz. Almaz is an elite tactical team in Belarus, akin to a SWAT unit, used for the most dangerous criminals. On or around December 21st, Almaz officers descended on a rented apartment in Kolodishchi, where Zhilnikov and Sukharko were hiding. The takedown was efficient and decisive. Both men were arrested and taken into custody. In that apartment, police reportedly found items linking them to the Alibagova street murders, such as the stolen passports and belongings of the victims. It was a solid catch, tying the bloody threads together. Under interrogation, Sukarko quickly cracked. Confronted with the evidence of 2 crime scenes and his own injuries, the 23-year-old orphan-turned-killer confessed to his role in the crimes. Zhilnikov, however, was less cooperative. The 43-year-old initially denied killing anyone, claiming he was merely a bystander or an unwilling participant. Investigators weren't buying it. The forensic evidence was overwhelming, and Sukarko's confession no doubt implicated Zhilnikov as an active perpetrator. The 2 suspects were brought face to face in a confrontation session, a common practice in post-Soviet investigations, to see if one will break down or accuse the other. In that tense meeting, as later recounted in court, Zhilnikov and Sukarko immediately turned on each other. Alexander Zhilnikov, trying to save his own skin, painted Sukarko as uncontrollable and hinted that Sukarko had wanted to kill Alina as well, to eliminate her as a witness. Zhilnikov claimed he had not intended any of this to go so far, that it was Sukarko who lost control. For his part, Sukarko flatly rejected Zhilnikov's account. He angrily accused his older partner of lying. According to Sukarko, the reality was different. He insinuated that Zhilnikov might have had a personal motive, suggesting that perhaps Zhilnikov had a hidden relationship or interest in Alina. In one statement, Sukarko said he suspected Zhilnikov had something going with Alina, implying that jealousy or a twisted love triangle might have provoked the stabbing spree. Zhilnikov vehemently denied this claim. He retorted that he barely knew Alina. He only knew her mother from the neighborhood. As for Alina herself, Zhilnikov crudely remarked that she wasn't particularly attractive, and he figured she had trouble with men. He admitted going to her flat to drink beer one day, where she confided in him about her cheating boyfriend and asked for help teaching the girl a lesson. This at least aligned with what Alina had actually done. In these dueling accusations, the outline of the truth was clear. Alina had solicited the attack, and Zhilnikov and Sukarko together had carried it out, each blaming the other for the excessive bloodshed. Both men were clearly guilty of multiple murders. And now a third suspect emerged unmistakably, Alina herself. She could no longer hide behind tears and silence. The hired hands had pointed the finger at their employer. Within days of the arrests, Alina Shulganova was also taken into custody, charged as the mastermind of the plot. News of the arrests and the motive behind the murders sent ripples through Belarusian media. The case was soon dubbed the Alibagova Street contract killings, emphasizing how this was not a spontaneous crime, but a calculated contract hit rooted in a love triangle. The idea that a seemingly mild young kindergarten teacher could instigate such horror captivated the public's grim interest. In fact, Alina's very normalcy, an educated, employed woman without any prior criminal record, made the story all the more shocking. As the investigation progressed, prosecutors pieced together the full timeline and publicly confirmed the broad strokes. Alina, unable to cope with losing her boyfriend, hired 2 thugs to assault his new girlfriend. But those thugs ended up murdering not just the girlfriend, but also the ex-boyfriend and another man in a separate incident. It was a tale both tragic and sordid. Over the next year, investigators gathered every bit of evidence to ensure conviction. Forensic experts documented the blood evidence, matching the stray blood at the scene to Sukarko's DNA. The stolen items recovered from the suspects linked them undeniably to the crime. There was also the matter of the earlier Kolodishchi murder. With Sukarko and Zhilnikov in custody, that case too was resolved. They confessed to killing the 59-year-old landlord during what was supposed to be a robbery. Thus, altogether 3 homicides were attributed to this deadly duo. For Belarusian authorities, this was an unusually high body count for a single case. The legal implications were clear. Under Belarusian law, murder of 2 or more people, especially with aggravating factors like robbery, is punishable by death or life imprisonment. Additionally, premeditated murder for hire is considered a grave aggravation. The stage was set for a major trial. Alina's role complicated the legal picture slightly. She had not wielded the knife, but she was the instigator. Indeed, by the time indictments were issued, Alina was formally accused of organization of causing grievous bodily harm, committed for hire and resulting in death. In essence, the law recognized that she meant to inflict serious injury on Victoria, and that death was a foreseeable outcome of such a violent plan. She was also charged with attempted kidnapping, a nod to the fact that part of her scheme involved possibly abducting Victoria. It appears Alina did not face a straight murder charge, because she had not explicitly ordered a killing. Nonetheless, her potential sentence was severe. As for Zilnikov and Sukharko, they faced the full brunt of murder charges. Specifically, the charges included murder of 3 persons for profit, armed robbery with intent to seize property of especially large value, and theft of personal documents, since they stole passports. The weight of these charges was enormous. Belarusian prosecutors signaled early on that they would seek the maximum penalty allowed, death by execution for the 2 men. The trial was scheduled in Minsk City Court, and it began almost exactly 1 year after the murders. On December 16, 2016, the courtroom opened on what would become one of the most dramatic criminal trials in recent Belarusian history. By now, the story had been widely reported. The media dubbed Alina the jealous ex-lover, and the men as her hired killers. Public interest was high, and the courtroom benches were filled with journalists and the victims' grieving families. On the defendant's bench sat 3 people whose fates were now entwined: Alexander Zilnikov, stocky and impassive; Vyacheslav Sukharko, fidgety and looking much younger than his 24 years; and Alina Shulganova, pale and tense, her once bright demeanor now replaced by evident remorse and fear. During the trial, a fuller picture of each defendant emerged. The prosecution laid out the evidence methodically: forensic analyses, witness testimonies, including that of the taxi driver who unwittingly transported the killers, and neighbors who heard suspicious noises, and the defendant's own prior statements. Photographs of the crime scene brought home the horror of what had happened: images of blood-soaked floors, and the number of knife wounds catalogued on autopsy reports. Family members in attendance wept or glared at the accused, some leaving the room when the most graphic details were discussed. When it came time for the defendants to speak, their personalities shone through in stark contrast. Sukharko surprised many by immediately pleading guilty. He openly admitted his role in the killings of all 3 victims and expressed contrition, albeit in a troubled way. In fact, Sukharko's guilt and despair were so deep that he did something extraordinary. He asked the court to sentence him to death. He declared he did not deserve to live after what he had done. Observers noted that Sukharko often behaved erratically during the proceedings. He would mumble, sometimes shout out of turn, and at one point he had to be removed from the courtroom for disruptive behavior. A court-ordered psychiatric evaluation found that while Sukharko did have some psychological issues, he was legally sane and fit to stand trial. His outbursts were likely the product of stress, remorse, and a lifelong instability amplified by the pressure of facing judgment. Zilnikov, in contrast, maintained a stubborn facade of innocence. He refused to plead guilty to the murders, claiming he wasn't the one who wielded the knife, effectively trying to pin most blame on Sukharko. Zilnikov portrayed himself as a minor participant who had witnessed the killings rather than carried them out. The evidence against him said otherwise, and his stance drew visible ire from the victims' families. Only very late in the trial did Zilnikov mutter a half-hearted apology to the families, and even that seemed prompted by strategy rather than genuine remorse. The victims' relatives noted that he only asked forgiveness in the closing statements, very belatedly. Then there was Alina. When it was her turn to address the court, Alina broke down. This once composed young woman was racked with guilt and sorrow. She tearfully expressed regret, not only for what happened to the victims, but she lamented that she had not gone to the police when she learned of the murders. Alina insisted that she never wanted anyone dead. She had only wanted to scare Victoria, she said. She seemed genuinely horrified at the outcome. Still, the families of the victims could not forgive her so easily. Over the course of the trial, the prosecutor outlined a clear narrative of the crime. On February 24, 2017, as proceedings neared conclusion, the state prosecutor delivered sentencing requests. Citing the unprecedented cruelty of the crimes and the calculated nature of the contract hit, the prosecutor asked the court to impose Belarus's highest punishment, the death penalty by shooting, on Zhilnikov and Sukharko. For Alina Shulganova, the prosecutor sought a prison term of 15 years, which was near the maximum allowed for her charges. In Belarus, 15 years was the upper limit for women at the time, since life imprisonment was not applicable to her charges, and the death penalty is not applied to female convicts in Belarus. The courtroom held its breath as these recommendations were read out. Sukharko, who had asked for death, merely nodded. Zhilnikov showed little emotion. Alina sobbed quietly. When invited to make final statements, Sukharko took the opportunity to again insist that he deserved death. "I agree that I need the exceptional measure," he told the court, using a euphemism for the ultimate penalty. When the judge pressed him, "Why do you think you should be executed?" Sukharko's response was poignant. "I don't know how to live with this," he said. Those in the courtroom could sense that despite his violent deeds, Sukharko was tormented by guilt. Zhilnikov, given his turn, still maintained he hadn't killed anyone intentionally, a statement that convinced few. Alina, in her final word, could only plead for mercy and apologize repeatedly through tears. On March 6, 2017, the Minsk City Court delivered its verdict. The judges found all three defendants guilty on the major counts. Yet, in a somewhat surprising move, the court did not sentence the two male killers to death. Instead, it opted for life imprisonment for both Alexander Zhilnikov and Vyacheslav Sukharko. Each man was ordered to spend the rest of his life in a special regime prison, effectively solitary confinement for the first years, as is common with lifers in Belarus. As for Alina, the court deemed her remorse and lesser role sufficient to warrant a sentence below the maximum. She was sentenced to 12 years in a general regime penal colony. This was 3 years less than what the prosecution had sought, but still a hefty punishment for a 26-year-old woman with no prior record. Additionally, the court ordered the convicts to pay substantial restitution to the victims' families, tens of thousands of rubles to each of several relatives, as compensation for their immense loss. When the verdict was announced, Sukharko bowed his head. He had essentially gotten the opposite of what he'd begged for, life in prison instead of death. Zhilnikov showed little outward reaction, but he too had narrowly escaped a death sentence, at least for the time being. Alina appeared relieved that she hadn't been given an even harsher term. 12 years meant she would still be relatively young when freed, perhaps around 38, with a chance to rebuild some sort of life. Observers noted that as the judge read the sentences, Alina stared ahead at a single spot, as if in a daze. However, the victims' families were not fully satisfied, particularly with Alina's sentence. To them, 12 years in prison seemed paltry compared to the magnitude of the crime. Zinaida, the sister of Vyacheslav Tikhomirov, told reporters after the verdict that 12 years was too mild for Alina. "Didn't she realize she was playing with fire?" the sister said bitterly, questioning how Alina could instigate such violence and then claim she hadn't intended it. The families were, on the other hand, supportive of the idea that the killers deserved the ultimate punishment. "They earned the death penalty," Zinaida said of Zhilnikov and Sukharko, referencing the unthinkable cruelty with which her brother and his girlfriend were treated. Another relative wondered aloud, why did they kill? They could have just robbed him. Why kill such a person? The sheer senselessness of the murders was hard to fathom for those left behind. In Belarus's justice system, initial verdicts from the regional courts, like Minsk City Court, are not necessarily final. Both defendants and prosecutors have the right to appeal to the Supreme Court. And in this case, everyone appealed. Alina's defense filed an appeal seeking a lighter sentence, hoping for an even shorter term given her stated remorse. Zhilnikov also appealed. In fact, he still maintained he should be acquitted of the most serious charges, clinging to his story of lesser involvement. Sukharko, interestingly, might not have appealed on his own, since he'd gotten more leniency than he wanted. but his lawyer was obliged to challenge the verdict regardless. And most significantly, the prosecution appealed, or more precisely, lodged a protest. The prosecutors believed that life imprisonment was too lenient for Zhilnikov and Sukharko given the brutality and multiple victims. They sought to overturn the life terms and impose death sentences instead. Thus, the case moved up to the Belarusian Supreme Court for review. On July 14, 2017, after reviewing the trial records, the Supreme Court of Belarus annulled the Minsk court's verdict and ordered a retrial. The Supreme Court found some procedural issues or considered the sentences inappropriate. The detailed reasoning wasn't public, but clearly the prosecution's argument for harsher punishment found traction. This decision meant that Alina, Zhilnikov, and Sukharko had to be tried all over again, with a new panel of judges, though largely the same evidence. The retrial commenced later that year, in September. Once again, the courtroom saw the trio of defendants. This time, the atmosphere was even more somber. The weight of what was at stake, literally life or death, hung over the proceedings. When the retrial hearings began, the script was largely similar. Overwhelming evidence of guilt was presented anew. But one notable shift was in Sukharko's demeanor. Perhaps resigned or depressed, he refused to even attend parts of the retrial. After another psychiatric evaluation in late 2017, Sukharko simply declined to be brought to court for subsequent sessions, and the judges allowed the trial to continue in his absence for practical purposes. Zhilnikov, on the other hand, participated and continued to profess his innocence in the murders, which rang just as hollow the second time around. Alina was present, quietly facing the renewal of her nightmare. On January 17, 2018, the retrial defendants were given a chance for final words. This time, both Zhilnikov and Sukharko reportedly wept and begged the court for mercy. Facing the real prospect of execution concentrated their minds. Even Zhilnikov, who had been defiant, now pleaded for his life, though he still did so while denying full responsibility. Sukharko, through his lawyer or written statements, since he wasn't physically present, also asked for clemency, a reversal from his earlier stance of welcoming death. On January 20th, the Minsk City Court, in its retrial capacity, delivered the new verdict. The outcome was the one the state had pushed for. Both Alexander Zhilnikov and Vyacheslav Sukharko were sentenced to death by firing squad. Alina Shulganova was once again given 12 years in prison, the same sentence as before. In Belarus, the death penalty is carried out by a single gunshot to the back of the head traditionally. It's a method kept shrouded in secrecy and done without advance notice to the convicts or their families. As such, the pronouncement of death is a momentous and frightening one. When the verdict was read, Zhilnikov and Sukharko reportedly hung their heads low. Observers noted they listened in stony silence, heads bowed, as the judge pronounced the words, "the exceptional measure of punishment, execution by shooting." The retrial sentence also included confiscation of their property as an added punishment, a relatively moot point given their fate. The legal odyssey was almost over, but not quite. After the retrial, the defense lawyers for Zhilnikov and Sukharko immediately appealed the death sentences to the Supreme Court. These would be the final appeals possible within Belarus's court system. During a Supreme Court hearing on May 29, 2018, an unusual scene unfolded. Sukharko, who had previously shunned the courtroom, was present this time. He made an emotional statement referencing life on death row. By this point, Sukharko and Zhilnikov had been kept on death row for some months. Execution is not immediate. There is a waiting period for appeals. Sukharko revealed to the Supreme Court that he had spent 4 months sharing a death row cell with other condemned prisoners whose appeals had been exhausted. He named 2 fellow inmates, Ale Mikhalenya and Andrei Hrishku, and said that just 2 weeks earlier, on May 15th, those 2 had been quietly taken away, presumably to be executed. "They took them away in the night," Sukharko said, "and I suspect they were shot." This chilling testimony underscored the grim reality he was facing himself. After making that statement, Sukharko requested to be removed from the court, perhaps overcome by despair. When the judges denied the request, since he needed to hear the proceedings, Sukharko did something darkly poetic. He began to loudly sing a song by the Soviet rock band Kino and recite verses from poet Vladimir Vysotsky. His voice rang through the chamber, forcing the judges to finally order him taken out. It was an eerie moment, a condemned man reciting poetry, defiantly or deliriously, facing the highest court in the land. Zhilnikov, in this final hearing, maintained his innocence to the end, still claiming he was just a witness and not a killer. Alina did not attend this Supreme Court appeal, likely because her sentence was not under challenge. The prosecution was content with her 12 years, and she perhaps did not dare to seek further reduction, given everything. The Supreme Court of Belarus delivered its final decision on May 30th, 2018. The appeals were denied. The court upheld the death sentences for Zhilnikov and Sukharko. With that, the domestic judicial process was exhausted. As the bailiffs moved to take the condemned men away, a reporter called out a question asking if they would seek clemency from President Alexander Lukashenko, the only person with the power to commute a death sentence in Belarus. Zhilnikov replied that he would petition for a pardon, a last glimmer of hope for him. Sukharko, in contrast, only gave a faint smirk when asked if he would do the same. Perhaps to him, mercy was neither expected nor even desired at this point. Alina, who had not been at that hearing, quietly went off to serve her prison term. She was sent to a women's correctional colony under a general regime. In Belarus, female prisoners often perform textile or sewing work as part of their incarceration. Even after the Supreme Court's decision, one avenue remained: international human rights intervention. Belarus's use of the death penalty has long been a point of contention, as it is the only country in Europe and the former Soviet Union that still carries out executions. In late 2018, Zhilnikov's lawyer submitted an individual appeal to the United Nations Human Rights Committee, claiming that his rights were violated in the process and pleading for intervention. The HRC responded by registering the complaint on December 24, 2018, and it formally requested Belarus to stay the executions while the committee reviewed the case. This kind of request is a diplomatic plea. It has no binding legal force over a sovereign country, but often countries will delay executions to show cooperation with international bodies. In parallel, Amnesty International and other human rights organizations launched campaigns calling on Belarus to grant clemency and to impose a moratorium on the death penalty. Pressure was mounting from European institutions as well. The Council of Europe urged Belarus to at least suspend executions as a step toward eventual abolition of capital punishment. For a few months, it seemed possible that Zhilnikov and Sukharko might languish on death row indefinitely, caught between a domestic sentence and international appeals. But Belarus's government has a record of ignoring such external pressures when it comes to capital cases. And so, in the summer of 2019, events reached their final tragic conclusion. On May 30th, family members of Zhilnikov visited him in Minsk's SIZO No. 1 prison, the detention center where death row inmates are held. They did not know it would be their last visit, but Zhilnikov perhaps sensed time was running out. He had been working with human rights activists to file one more petition to the Prosecutor General, claiming new evidence and pleading for a review. That petition was in motion, but it would ultimately be too late. 2 weeks later, Zhilnikov's lawyer arrived at the detention center for a scheduled meeting, only to be told that her client was no longer there. In the euphemistic phrasing used by prison officials, Zhilnikov had left to carry out the sentence. The lawyer immediately understood what that meant. She asked directly if he had been executed, and the officials quietly confirmed it. By practice, Belarus conducts executions in secrecy and only informs relatives after the fact. Within days, Zhilnikov's family received official notice that the sentence had been carried out. The specific date of execution was not stated, but it is believed Zhilnikov was shot around that June 13th, 2019 date. As for Sukharko, the authorities did not immediately confirm his fate. However, given that Belarus typically executes co-defendants in a case at the same time, it is almost certain that Sukharko was executed alongside Zhilnikov in June 2019. In Belarus, executed prisoners are buried in unmarked graves by the state. and families are not told the location, adding another layer of cruelty for those left behind. International observers were outraged that Belarus went ahead with the executions despite the UN's plea. The UN Human Rights Committee issued a statement condemning the execution of Alexander Jilnikov, noting that Belarus had violated the committee's request for a stay. But the protest fell on deaf ears in Minsk. The Belarusian authorities did not comment in detail, maintaining their long-held position that international bodies cannot dictate its use of lawful punishment. And so the case of the Alibagova Street killings came to its definitive end. Alina Shulganova remains in prison as of this writing, serving out her 12-year sentence in a women's penal colony. Barring any reduction or early release, which seems unlikely given the gravity of her crime, she will be in her late 30s by the time she regains freedom. She has largely disappeared from public view. No high-profile appeals or letters have emerged from her. One can only speculate how she reflects on the events that she set in motion. Events that took the life of the man she claimed to love and 2 others, and in turn destroyed her own life as well. Thanks again for listening, and thank you so much for all the great reviews. If you enjoy hearing true crime cases that are rarely covered in English, please consider subscribing. It really helps the show grow and lets us keep bringing you stories you won't find anywhere else.